Welcome back to the CTO Playbook, the podcast dedicated to helping CTOs excel. If the biggest risk in your company's technology stack isn't the code at all, but the people and processes holding it all together, then today's episode is just what you need. I'm joined by Matteo di Battista at Marcello Modica, who spent decades guiding Italian companies through the messy reality of modernizing ERP platforms. We'll explore why so many organizations are trapped by technical debt, single points of failure, and outdated monoliths, and how to escape. Let's get into it. Matteo, Marcello, it's brilliant to have you on the podcast. There's a lot to cover, but let's start simple, shall we? Can you just tell us who you help, what you do, and how you got started on this journey?
Hello, Adam. Thank you for your question. I started to work in IT 25 years ago. I started as a technician from IBM, and I studied a lot the software development. My journey started from AS400 when IBM called it 400. And I worked on Lotus Domino too, and started with these kind of databases, and then moved to the ERP implementations. And then I moved in my last 10 years into the cloud native ecosystem software development. Started when the cloud of AWS come in the industry. And then we choose a cloud native development technologies called WaveMaker. And then we help some company to have the right pace on the digital transformations journey.
Right. Also
integrating a new modern way to develop with an API first approach, I think. And then help company on scalable technologies to work on modernize the ERP and integrate new small microservices around the ERP, not more inside it, and deploy it in a good delivery and a high delivery pace in the cloud.
Excellent. And just to put us in a bit of context, I mean, ERP, which is enterprise resource planning, just tell us a little about some of the sort of the typical challenges or everyday things that customers are solving with their ERP platforms, just so we put it into context for those people who aren't as familiar with the software category.
What we develop is typically a software that work on manufacturing and also the company that want to transform an internal software and data into some new business that could be a new SaaS software that want to deliver into the market. For example, some customer have devices, medical devices, for example, right. And then they want to acquire confidence on deploy this software as a service, integrating some, for example, billing, some API to consume through the market, and some new technologies like IoT, but integrated with the data that come from dozens of years of experience based on ERP.
Excellent. Cool. And so can you just tell us a little bit then about the sort of the clients you work with? Because you mentioned a few there, but you also sort of mentioned about some of those clients working and sitting on top of quite a bit of technical debt. And sometimes they don't necessarily understand it all. So have you got a way of sort of explaining to us a sort of a typical scenario or a classic example of where a company comes across this kind of challenge?
Sure. We see that when you work inside the monolith, like the ERP, you come into, you will be stuck, the company could stuck into the monolith using always the same technologies and only inside the monolith. Then this monolith was no more usable and extendable, and they need to acquire new talents, new technologies to integrate it, and then his customer want to use, for example, mobile, new interfaces, modern interfaces. So they come into the modernization journey, and to do it, they cannot use the entire stack to deliver. They cannot be focused on the architecture, meanwhile on the middleware, meanwhile on the software developments and DevOps. So we see that these companies need to split the focus into microservices. If they do not do it, they acquire technical debt because they always insert it. When they develop, they increase the technical debt during development phase.
Because they're building on something that's been around for a long time.
Right. The example was, for example, the one of our customer that have an episode where the CTO died, unfortunately, and they see that they have an knowledge silos. So this knowledge was based only on top of one key people. And that was terrible. Because even if the development teams can work, they are not more managed. And all the code was inside a code base that is completely unreadable. And if they continue to work in this manner, they will acquire technical debt instead of moving in the modernization phase. How to solve it? They need to start to deliver software through API, not more inside the monolith. So create some satellite of software completely based on open standard without vendor lock-in and without developers lock-in.
Okay, and what do you mean by not having developers lock-in? Do you mean so you're not reliant on a few individuals within the organization then?
Yes. The reason why some company doesn't want to have developers lock-in, that is a sort of lock-in based on the person knowledge, not on the functional layer of the software, not on the technical. The technical layer, like the language, it's no more important if you abstract everything with the API. You could start to attach with some standard software the database, and this software must abstract everything into API, like the AWS do. If you think like AWS, you think that every service on AWS could be consumed by API. You have to imagine that if you move into a standard, similar dictionary between developers, you will have a team that speaks the same language, not Java or React, simply API. And if you abstract this layer, you will move your microservices like you will move your developers on consuming the abstraction layer through API. So they will consume not the ERP, but the function inside the ERP. That is a completely different.
Because you're separating out the front end from the middle tier and from the data, so essentially in order to be able to make it more pluggable.
Yes, it's more pluggable, right? And if you do it, you could insert technologies like continuous integration, continuous delivery based on single small repositories for single functionality. And the teams start to be small. And when you have small teams, the communication between teams will be really, really quick. Another way to do modernization is to do not start from code, but start from visual interface. If you start visually, it's not important the technical skills, but you will cut the distance between designers and coders. And this gap is where the technical depths live, because there are a lot of misunderstanding between who designed and who developed. If you cut this street between it this way, you will increase the communication and the delivery base.
And so there's an argument for saying then that all of the engineers need to get closer to the business by getting closer to the front end in effect.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you move it in its SaaS components, okay, you could add in your platform that now it's public, okay, some components created by small teams. And then if you choose the right tools to do it, you will have the tools that guide the technical skills, not more the single engineer.
Right.
Because you will resolve the problem that the software work on my laptop, but not in production. It's funny, but everyone that work in this industry, listen this phrase. Why you joke?
And in a lot of these cases, I think it's true that the business gets to a certain point where everything's working fine, and then suddenly they notice, oh, okay, now it's no longer fine. Things are actually pretty broken. In your experience, what is the trigger for them getting to the point where they realize, okay, we've got to modernize, we've got to change? I mean, because you mentioned a few things like IoT and new interfaces and new delivery of service as opposed to delivery of outcome. But what is normally the trigger? What's the point at which some organization gets to when they've got an ERP and they think, okay, this is no longer working for us?
I think that the trigger is when you don't know how the software is created. Okay. When you spend too much time in maintenance instead of evolution, and you can measure it, and when you pass the 60% of your time maintaining the software base, you have to stop to develop and start to choose the right tools to standardize the software development. Nothing related to language, Java, React, nothing yet. Simply to abstract visually the bottom layer of languages, frameworks. Sometimes we use WaveMaker, that is an low-code tool, but this low-code tool is something that let the developers to work on the code too. So it's quite flexible. But even if it is possible and flexible, doesn't let the developers to create too much from scratch. So it's a good middle layer where put only API on it and then work visually to attach the front end to this API. But the bottom layer that call that dialogue with database, it completely abstracted. So you will work on functionality, not on SQL of data, or it is another kind of job. It is data analysis, it is data scientist, but it's not software delivery, because software, the pace of delivery depends on feedback loop.
Yep.
It doesn't have a good pace. When you work on SaaS, if it doesn't have a good feedback loop and rapid feedback, you will lose because you are spending too much time on waiting some idea that is already changing.
Yeah. And you mentioned there that teams get to about 60% of maintenance. I mean, that is an incredibly high number. So I'm going to guess from that a lot of the scenarios we're talking about are customers who probably had a system in place for many, many years, if not many decades by the time they get to that stage. Is that roughly true?
Yes, it's true. I think that it happens too much when you work on mainframes, for example, and 60% is typical here in our market in Italy. It's because sometimes the companies here are small, doesn't hire developers inside the company, but leverage too much freelancers for a short period that create some software only dedicated to solve small problems and then forgot it completely.
Right. So they haven't had the best practices to start with. They've not got a good foundation. And so they are really just modernizing from a as you say, a decades old system and bring it up to a modern level of application development then?
Yeah.
I say I don't mean to minimize it, because I can appreciate that in some cases there's incredibly complex business scenarios where the data's flowing around.
Sure. I want also to add another topic, that is, you have also to create a community around these standards. You have to take notice that the problem is you could not create silos of knowledge, but you have to create some developers like soldiers. Sorry. Unfortunately, I think that 50 years ago, okay, in the manufacturings, we standardized the delivery of machine. For example, in automotive, you cannot work without machinery to create cars.
Yeah.
Okay. In the software, only 20 years ago, you have only engineers extra paid with high salary. Now, through low code, through the pervasive of software development, you cannot stack on a single person without tools to create software, because the stack is too large, and because the software is pervasive and you cannot make it only on top of a single person for a risk reason. And you have for the same risk reason, you have to create a community around the standards, and the company must create these standards.
Yeah.
Companies or a community in the territory or in the cloud. So someone that share the same delivery methods and development methods. If you have the right tools, it's the tools that orchestrate these methods. And sorry, but I think that in the next future, the developers could be replaceable. And the company want to replace it or have a job market that to replace this kind of employees, right? Yeah.
And so when you say that they need to be more like soldiers, it's almost a bit like they're consultants, but the standardization is a drive such that you no longer have to employ people who dedicated internally just look after the software. Instead, you rely on the fact that it's a standardization layer so that you can bring in a consultant who understands the standardized layer and who can deliver rapidly using modern tools, modern techniques, and a modern interface, the custom requirements that are needed by that particular manufacturer, for example. Is that a good summary of where you're coming from there?
Yes. Also, I think that in the next future, we will have two kind of development. One based on large corporations that leverage low code with internal teams, small internal teams, and then freelancers that use always low code, no more notepad or editors of coding, but simply visually create tons of small software as a services with not too much users, but simply with 200 maximum users, and are a small company that deliver many of these kind of small software as a services. And they will need to make it frequently on top of some standards, because low code accelerate delivery.
Yeah.
And freelancers will deliver it through a model that is the service, not more the consultancies. So the words will be split into large corporations that consume software as a service from a suite of freelancers that turn around a community of methods and components that will be consumable, from their corporations.
Got it. Okay, so there's going to be a high degree of standardization at the bottom of the stack, underneath where we would typically be looking. where in the past we would have had custom databases, custom ORMs. That's all going to be standardized out in your view, such that the delivery on top of that, on top of a standardized foundation, is a new abstraction layer effectively.
Yeah, we are in the middle of this scenario, because our tools permit us also to write code, not only visual implementation. And it is a middle layer of the market. Sometimes discussing with some person that work on fund or startup companies say how that in the first round of a startup, you have the ideas and some engineers that create the best algorithm to invest on. But then you have to do it based on some standards, internationalizations, and also need to have a good scalable architecture, but maintaining intellectual properties. So you cannot leverage tools with a high level of low coding, but you have to maintain a flexibility also for code. But scale, because the second round of investment is something that need to scale.
Yeah.
And that go to market. Our tools is here. Our company are trying to modernize this layer, this kind of investment of software development.
Got it. So it's standardizing and simplifying that, but also building on top of the key requirements that it needs to be scalable, secure, and standardizable.
Yeah. It have two outcomes. The first is scalability, but the second one is to not acquire technical debt when you are scaling.
Yeah.
I want to add also that in Italy, we are working now with this community, as you mentioned, that we are building on, which is sharing the same tool, for example, which it doesn't really matter what the tool is for us, obviously, nowadays, is Wavemaker. And our clients really like the approach, because in this community, we have been joining from around 10 software hours at the moment. We just started a couple of years ago. And we do share the same technologies and development techniques with our customers. So sometimes if a company cannot take over a job from a certain customer, which is inside the community, another companies can take over. And it's not it's counterproductive for a company that have to sell their time, but for a company that have to sell the best services possible for the customer is amazing.
So in other words, it gives you a better customer outcome that way, even though on each individual deal, you're maybe not making quite as much money as others would do, because you're not locking them in, you're not forcing them to take time from you, and you're allowing things to run quicker.
At the same time, yes, but at the same time, we can take customer from other opportunities, which so pretty much he's still on the same level, but the customer satisfaction in that is much higher, because they don't feel like relegated to only one company and they are slave by this company, for example, or by individual developers, for example, as well.
Cool. And, I think that's really important, because I love building communities and bringing communities together. I think that's one of those key things. But it also takes some a level of braveness, really, to sort of go, okay, we're going to start a new way of delivering software in this ecosystem, whether it's geographical or whether it's any other mechanism, and say, we're now going to go in a different road. We're going to take a different approach. What was it that drove you two guys to think, okay, we've got to do it this way around, because it's just, even though it's different, it's the right way?
So the reason why we decided to go this way is because we had so many requests of so many companies that, as we were talking about before, they accumulated this technical debt. Many, every time there is the same problem, which is replicated, but just on a different company. So we decided to take, okay, what would be the best solution to give sort of support to this company, to create a community, and to build an ecosystem for the Italian average company as well. I think this is a scenario which is very vertical in Italy, but I think probably not in the USA, but in Europe is quite common as well. And so that was the demand, actually, the demand of the customer. That was actually the main reason why we decided to build that, is because that's the sort of need we felt from our customer. And so basically we are doing this with a confederation of Italian industries in Italy,
right,
which is like that's from the government, sort of. and then we are doing this together with them, and we getting a new customer and new companies across. Thanks for them as well.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think when you're building something from the point of view of thinking customer first, I can't think of pretty much any better reasons to go about something. So that's really encouraging from that perspective. Although as you do that, it normally does involve some mindset shifts, both on your part, but also on the buyer's part as well. What were some of the sort of the hardest mindset shifts that either you or your customers had to make to this model of delivering services?
I think the main struggle we find out is with developers, actually. Decision makers into companies, they are always up for innovate, actually.
Right.
But they have this wall, this massive wall, which is developer will. So basically, in Italy, what is happening, at least what I've seen since I've joining Marcello and we're doing this company together, is been that the developer is in charge of the decision. Indirectly, they are blackmailing the company to decide what the technology stack is. If I think about an industry, for example, Fiat, where they make cars, the employee doesn't really decide what sort of machinery they're going to use in that company or not. And if you want to replicate this sort of example in the software industry, I think this is something which should be in similar terms as well.
And so with this sort of challenge, what was your main approach for overcoming this? Because it sounds as though that's quite a wall of resistance.
Demonstrate with number that the delivery pace could change.
Right.
It is the only way to convince someone, but the problem is that you will not convince developers, but only decision maker on the top level managers. And that's crazy, but every time we speak with developers, they want to change every week language, framework, or technologies, even if they are completely stuck on delivery pace. So developers have not in mind the happy customers.
No, it sounds as though they have their own CV more in mind than the happy customer.
Yeah. What's you hadn't have a lot of experience on development industry, and Matteo explain you what is the example and the similarity between manufacturing, machinery, and software development. What's your experience on it when you work on a large software company like you? How this kind of company solve the problem of developers that doesn't want to watch the entire software development life cycle, but only the small part of algorithm and language?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the movement recently has been away from people who are very focused and very specific in a very certain area of whether it's a technology stack or whether it's the business understanding, the business model, and moving towards one where every engineer is getting closer to the actual customer and is exposed to the customer. And so the movement that I've seen is where a lot of engineers now have a part of their compensation, which is sort of the ultimate driver of behavior, really, is how, are you going to get paid or not? Moving towards one where it's involved on the business level KPIs as part of where they're going. And that, if you think about a larger organization where you've got a sort of a tree shape of different teams, leaders, and the ultimate decision-making for what the business is actually doing, the more that that's connected all the way up to the ultimate goal of what the organization is trying to do, I think the more aligned you end up with individual engineers to the outcome of the organization, which typically is going to be aligned with what the customer needs, because that's what the customer is going to pay for. And so I think that the thing that's made the biggest difference in the companies that I've seen where it's very fragmented, like you mentioned, where people have their own agenda rather than looking at, what's best for the organization and for the customer, and those that are very aligned and are very mission focused in what they're doing, is normally comes down to the clarity that the leadership can bring to everybody else and the way that they can enforce that clarity through behavior, through ultimately whether and how people get paid. And I think in the US, it's a lot closer to the way that the money flows because of the fact that employment is at will. And so therefore, if somebody is not performing, then within 2 weeks, they can be gone. In Europe, that is often minimum 1 month. And in some cases, it can be 3 months until you got rid of somebody. And then in other cases, you've got a union to negotiate with in between as well. And the union's job effectively is to try and protect people's roles. Now, it's not to say that unions are bad. They have their place. But they do add an additional layer in between what the customer needs and what the individual is doing in a large organization. And so I think that's one of the things that I've seen that's different, geographically. But I think also just in terms of performance-wise, as you mentioned, to answer your question, it is that clarity. How clear can the CTO or the company leadership make it as to what individual engineers need to be doing and how their work connects to that of the whole organization?
Good. Understood.
And I think, from my experience, because I've worked in this sort of strange in-between space, I was working at Palantir for a while, which is kind of a combination between sort of services and delivering products, part consulting and part delivering on something that's standardized. And I think having that understanding as an individual, contributor in those kind of organizations, the better you have an understanding between the way that the service and the value is delivered and what the product does, the better that you can actually align the work to generating valuable outcome.
Absolutely.
Good. We have a new, also, I don't know if we can speak it now. We are also approach another kind of business. Matteo is driving it. When we work with Wavemaker, Wavemaker was one of the companies that was engaged from GSMA, from telco providers to create the network API standard with Nokia.
Right.
So we are in partnership with Nokia and other players that come from UK to try to integrate into Wavemaker and into the market the networks API that is a new standard that not so new, was managed by Linux Foundation under the name of Camara API. And I think that it could be used and integrated in many of the features of software now have because these network API are something that could be used by software to have information, real-time information, where is after the call of this API, you will have data from where a mobile phone is, geofencing, identity. You can ask without an OTP if the transaction for paying is coming from the right mobile phone. And I think that we will have in the next month also a layer from business perspective, but also technically speaking, inside our value proposition. I don't know if in your country someone has started to speak about it, because in Italy no one are speaking about it.
I mean, so if I've understood that right, it's basically a standardized way of being able to access services but pay them through the mobile phone agreement in a standardized way. Is that the essential value there?
It's mostly the most case study we see now is, for example, for identity verification. So let's say you want to match the data the MNO have with the data, for example, that the user is inputting into the platform. So you can cross-match those two data, and you can see is an additional layer of identification to see whether the owner of the SIM card basically is the same person that is trying to access to the platform, make a payment, do a transaction. So there is many real-time information that you can acquire, and I think they're gonna be a game changer in terms of fraud prevention, for example, as well, and to add an additional layer of identity as well. So I think
the first approach that the industry is having with this API is for fraud prevention.
Right.
It's because fintech is using it as one of the most adopted. We are trying to understand if other use case could be leverage this API. And there are tons of use cases to use it, because if you are imagine that now most of the platform access, signing, checkout of the payments are based on SMS, you will have an KYC and transaction and retaining customer increased too much. It is a very good standard to investigate on.
Yeah, I mean, where you have standards around things like identity and some of these standard checks that need to be made, I think it makes a big difference. One of the things I noticed in moving from the UK to Sweden is that in the UK, in the financial arena, there's a lot of sort of know your customer, so identifying who your customer is and retaining that level of confidence in the identification of the customer, which is difficult if, for example, what you have is a phone number, but that phone number could be passed around from person to person. Whereas in Sweden, and in fact much in the Nordics, we have this concept of bank ID, which is a very strong identification level, which when you buy something, like for example, a mobile phone contract, you need to have a strong identification that goes down to the bank level, who owns your bank account. And so therefore it isn't quite national level ID, but it's not far off it. In terms of strong tie between an individual notifier or identifier and a person, a natural person who you can identify, and so it cuts out a whole load of these challenges around anti-money laundering and so on. Because if you can't fake who you are easily, there's a mechanism where everybody uses a system, identifies strongly on that system, which is what happens in the Nordics. You stand out immediately if you're somebody who's not strongly identified. And so therefore the fraud risk on that immediately has to be scored very highly. And so what I've noticed is that where you've got a sort of a national level infrastructure for identity, like there is in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, you end up with a totally different ratio between these sort of KYC AML struggles, which you have in places like Britain, Spain, Italy, and to some extent France, versus where you got strong ID. And in America, where it's even more difficult to strongly identify somebody, it's a whole nother challenge.
Absolutely.
I think that in the future we will not have only one standard for identification, but it could be another layer that in every transaction, real-time transaction, or one of the way to acquire IQOS, quality of services between and cellular network, is to, for example, imagine to have a crowd area. In this crowd area, you want to increase the QoS during the transaction. You could ask to telco provider to increase it only in this area through this API. There are tons of use cases where to put this network API. And if you imagine that it could be another additional layer of security, identification, QoS, geofencing, I think that we will have to try to have some market and positioning on it here in Italy, where now one I have speaking about it.
Yeah.
And you mentioned modular systems and decomposing ERPs into these modular systems quite a bit, and we've spoken about some of those potential modules there. But in terms of the core platform that you're building on, we've spoken about WaveMaker quite a bit, but just tell us a little bit more about what WaveMaker is, where it comes from, and why you chose that as a sort of the foundation platform for your general work.
Yeah, WaveMaker comes from, I think it was created by a Google spin-off, then acquired by VMware. So I think it is a mature platform. I think that born about 15 years ago. And it is now acquired by an Indian company that migrated on a cloud journey and move it in a global platform, wavemakeronline.com, which is it because instead of create our DevOps layers, we have development environment, testing environment, production environment, continuous delivery. We have simply behind the browser every tools instead of, have you ever see the picture of Cloud Native Foundations tool? You have about 200 of tools to acquire and use, and skills on it With WaveMaker, we have only one tools, and inside of it, one developers could start to create instantly, nothing more than one laptop and the browser. This is why my first approach with WaveMaker. Then I see that I was very quick on deliver software based on my customer requirements, and then choose it. But I see also that it is not for only for small projects. I flight to London in the Paramati headquarters and see that there was a roadmap on this problem. The roadmap is try to create an collaboration platform for developers, but for professional developers that want to make hands-on code too. And this is the reason that permit me to never be stuck inside the platform. When I want to create or develop a new components or new features, I can always add some snippets of code and then add it. So I never be stuck for any alternative development that is not already on this platform. But this platform gave me in every part the way to do not reinvent the wheels, because WaveMaker produce software that is really open source with no royalties when I do it inside AWS for runtime. It integrate the software that WaveMaker produce is something that is already certified for Veracode. So the reason why I'm using WaveMaker is for two single reasons. Okay, the first is high pace of delivery, high standardization, and then high customization.
But does it not end up replacing one set of technical standards and lock-in for another set of standards and lock-in? How does it avoid that sort of uniqueness scenario?
With open source.
So because of the fact that it's built on top of open source foundations and the fact that all the tools in there, all the code generated is...
It's because even if WaveMaker is an online platform, you could push all of your code in your PC using IntelliJ or GitHub for repositories. So you could put all the code outside WaveMaker when you want. So if you want to make it flexible, you could, even if WaveMaker is only the runtime for run it in these different three stages.
Cool. Okay, so if we were to try and break down what it is that you do into a playbook, then because I think we talked about this a bit before, but we've covered some of this. But I think the first thing you mentioned at the very beginning was the technical debt. So the first one is sort of starting off by resolving the technical debt. And how do you begin to get leaders to see the technical debt in the first place, especially if they've been ignoring it for years?
We will, it's not a great invention. It's simply something that is, please tell us what is the visual part of your request, and we start to design it, not implement some engine inside the company to get the data. We will start with WaveMaker designing and drawing it, and with one button, we deploy an POC for this person, but with the database already attached, so the customer can use it from the first day.
Right. So you demonstrate to them the difference between what they had as a process previously and what you're doing now.
It is not only a demonstration. Our POC is completely reliable to work on production from the first day. That's quite strange, but if we use our pipeline, you could deliver instantly on AWS the same container you are using in development mode.
So perhaps my word of demonstration was the wrong word. Perhaps I meant proof. You prove to the customer that you can do it quickly and efficiently, more so than they've seen previously.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Okay. And I think the other thing you mentioned there as well was removing the bottlenecks from the existing platforms. And by the sounds of it, by taking the ERP and essentially working alongside of it to make sure that you are not stuck with the limitations of the ERP that you're helping to resolve.
When you work on ERP, you have to imagine that ERP must be split on single microservices. Our approach is to ERP typically have on one single database. We attach WaveMaker, okay, completely on top of with a connector on top of the database, even if it's simply a JDBC database that could be connected. Okay, the WaveMaker will translate it everything in REST API. If you have REST API for it, you can no more watch your database, let it in the head of database administration that check for index and performance, okay? But the developers could start to work on API functionality, not more on connection of the database, because you simply need to work on WaveMaker, say, click one button with import Swagger file as API, and you will have on your microservices everything that is now abstracted on REST instead of connecting and use SQL to get the data and paginations and everything that is modern.
So it's a nice quick abstraction layer, very quickly built using the standard tool then.
We attach for a huge American company that have 100 years of experience. I think that his JD Edwards was customized for 50,000 of employees, I think, in the world. We attach it and grab everything, every tables on database in 5 minutes, simply decide what tables need to be converted as REST, and WaveMaker do it as a proxy.
So that's a very, very quick way of getting access to all the data inside the monolith, but then make it flexible enough to be able to work on pretty much how you want to from then onwards.
Yeah.
Excellent. And so therefore, it's on top of that layer that you then start building essentially the components, the individual pieces that you make up the solution you're going to work with.
Exactly. And you have two approaches. You can continue to work with the visual interfaces with WaveMaker, and this is quick too, yeah, or attach a reactive interface developed with a JavaScript framework inside the browser. Okay, but the reality is that you are working on top of your ERP, but by REST.
And I think that the key last step, although it isn't last, it sort of comes first, is to build that community of providers who can all work on top of that standardized interface so that you end up with a lot more flexibility in the way that you then work with your ERP from then onwards.
Yes. The reason when you have API, you could also have components based on it, right? If you imagine the frame inside the page, you could imagine it as a component. So if I'm speaking about WaveMaker have prefabs, what they call components, okay? Prefabs is a component that can live inside different applications, but the data source of a component, it's not more a database. Could be only REST API, Swagger file. So you have to create different components, vertical for features, and then add it as a plugin. It's pluggable inside different applications. If your community was agreed on create horizontal components, you can spread it inside different applications when in a sort of marketplace where you can choose the component to use.
And then as a buyer, that gives you huge flexibility in terms of not being locked in anymore.
Completely flexible, yeah. And inside what kind of license of WaveMaker that is the team and the enterprise have an enterprise development network inside of it that work literally in this manner, because the enterprise development network inside WaveMaker sell components to the enterprise. So you have to imagine an internal marketplace for the huge companies that detach from the marketplace the components that developers can use.
Wonderfully powerful. Excellent. Thank you very much for today, Marcello and Matteo. Any last things? How can people get hold of you to continue the conversation?
So you can reach us to LinkedIn, Matteo Di Battista and Marcello Modica, or you can write us at info@pluma.it, or you can visit our website. There is a contact form, and so these are the the preferred ways. Yeah. Or you can call me as well if you like.
No, we'll put those links in the show notes. That'll be fantastic. Let's quickly resolve Marcello's playbook then into a simple, straightforward 5-step process. So step 1 is to sidestep most of the technical debt, which in an ERP system tends to come from the user interface, which is tied to the ERP, and that messy middle tier of business logic. The main way of doing that is with step 2, which is to eliminate the single point of failure, and that is access to the database. They tend to do that by sticking on the database a standardized REST interface that enables the next stages in the process. So step 3, start modernizing the monolithic ERP. And they do that by building vertical components that sit directly on top of that REST interface that they've put in place that's very quick to put in. And they basically have from there a way of putting in quick, modern workflows that sit directly on top of that REST interface. Step 4 then is the fact that it's built out of a composable solution. So the pieces that they build tend to be reusable, either in other organizations or in other workflows. And one of the key things to making that composable solution cheap is by making a full community of providers who can add into that library, extensive library of SaaS services that can be built on top of pretty much any ERP. And so that's step 5, is creating that community of providers. That's it for today's episode of the CTO Playbook. A huge thank you to Matteo Di Battista and Marcello Modica for sharing their experiences on how to escape the traps of technical debt and single points of failure in monolithic ERP systems. If today's conversation resonated with you, remember, you don't have to figure it out the hard way. At the CTO Playbook, you'll find coaching, cohorts, and resources designed to help you lead with clarity, confidence, and impact. Learn more at thectoplaybook.com. Until next time, keep leading with impact. Thank you for listening to the whole episode. I appreciate your time. So just before you go, I'd like to ask you for a favor in return for putting together this episode of the CTO Playbook for you. Please share the episode with just one person who will appreciate it. Wherever you're listening, whether that is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or another platform, sharing the episode will help more CTOs find the podcast and enable me to create more great content. Remember that you can find more information on thectoplaybook.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode of the CTO Playbook.